Right, so hello and welcome to Blueprint Cymru, a podcast bringing ideas, experience and ambition to the conversation of building a better future for Wales. My name is Simon Hobson. In today's episode, I'm joined by Samuel Parry. Sam is a lecturer and researcher at Cardiff Metropolitan University. He has recently completed his PhD, for which he explored the intersection of longue durée history, political economy, world systems analysis and nationalism. His recent research examines why some regions, such as Wales, struggle to develop economically within larger states, and how geography, history and institutional design shape those outcomes over the long term. Drawing on case studies from Wales, Catalunya and Mezzogiorno, Sam offers fresh insight into how stateless nations can design policies for resilience, autonomy and prosperity in an interconnected world. This work is especially relevant to anyone thinking about the future of Wales, its economy, its politics and its place in the world. It's great to have you on the podcast, Sam. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Very much looking forward to it.
So perhaps you could give the listener a little bit of background yourself, your childhood, and where you grew up, things like that, and how you ended up in academia.
Yeah, of course. So, as you said, my name is Sam Parry. I'm originally from Cardiff. Was brought up in Cardiff. Went to Welsh medium education all the way through here. Left Wales briefly for my undergraduate degree. I went to the London School of Economics to do my undergraduate, which was a great experience, but very interesting in the sense that that's probably the time I came to know most kind of the differences that existed between Wales and England, I'd say. Of course, when you're in a place, you don't really realize what makes it unique and what makes it different. So I kind of knew during my 3 years that I wanted to come back to Wales. That was something I always wanted to do. So I went straight afterwards to do a master's in Welsh politics and governance at Cardiff University. Left academia for a couple of years, joined the real world. I did I worked in the Senedd for a little bit. I worked for Plaid Cymru in research for a little bit. And then, I kind of got talking to some academics about this idea of, originally it was how do we explain the economy of Wales? How do we understand the economy of Wales? That was kind of where the idea of the PhD started. And from then it sort of developed that perhaps then we need to look at other case studies, other places, etc. So I completed the PhD around 18 months ago, something like that. And then I've been working in Cardiff Met as a lecturer for almost 2 years as well.
So perhaps we could explain to the listener what longue durée is in the context of your studies.
Of course. So longue durée in French literally just means the long term. So it's, I know it can be always scary when you kind of see methodology that you're kind of not familiar with. But if I explain the problem that longue durée history was trying to sort of overcome, maybe that will help explain it. So longue durée history kind of began really in the 1920s in France originally. And if I could use a metaphor, say you're above a hill and you're looking out onto some agricultural land, right? And you have all these fields and every field is kind of perfectly maintained, wonderful, but you've got hedgerows, fences, etc. between each field. So they argued that this sort of represents academia. So political scientists, for example, being one field, sociologists in another, historians in another, and they don't kind of cross-germinate and kind of talk with one another in the way that, our real world does. So if you're a political scientist, you might try and kind of isolate the institution, right? So, the Westminster, Senedd, whatever, from the society. If you're an economist, you try and isolate the economy from community, If you're a historian, you probably don't take into account these other factors. So they were trying to create a sort of multidisciplinary way of looking at the world. They said that our world doesn't look like it does in the textbooks, so neither should the way that we discuss it. Now, obviously, it's not possible to discuss all things at all times, but it's kind of trying to understand that, you know, don't put ourselves into these small silos. Try and kind of look at the wider picture. And then that came to the second problem, I guess, so why it's called, you know, the long-term history. They said that lots of histories kind of looks at what they term the event. So you might look at, say, World War II history, and what you do there is that you look at, you know, what happened on a specific day in 1939, what happened in a specific battle at a specific time, and you're essentially kind of noting one thing after another, right? But they say, well, okay, to really understand history, we need to kind of go deeper. We have to look at the roots of these things and how they develop. So if you're kind of looking at events, you might kind of just see it as a section of, you know, quote unquote, great men coming in, doing their thing, imprinting their voice on the canvas type of thing. But in reality, you know, that canvas is already painted. So you can only kind of affect it in certain ways. So you have to kind of start as far back as you can. You have to look at the geographies of places in a real, you know, in a real way, how geography shapes our societies, our cultural understandings, the way that it shapes the way that trade can work, the way it can move, the way geography helps us to understand the way that we think of ourselves. So in a very basic way, you know, if you look at Catalunya and Castile, you know, around Madrid, and why they kind of see the world differently, well, Catalunya's whole history is kind of looking out to the Mediterranean Sea. So most of their kind of contact would have been originally with southern France, Italy, northern Africa, whereas Castile is sort of a state of the hinterland, you know, of mountains, was not based around the sea at all. So it was always kind of more inward looking in the way it understood itself. So you can see there from geography, all of these kind of mentalities and the way we understand the world kind of develop from there.
And is there a certain point in history that one has to have? Do you have to have a certain amount of time available in order to study in this way, or can you apply 10 years as equally as 1,000 years to an area?
Yeah, so that's obviously a really big question, and it's one I'm kind of grappling with myself, right? So, you know, sometimes if you want to write an academic paper, or if you want to talk about the world today, it's not useful to be able to discuss all the things that have happened before. You know, you don't have the space or the time to do that. I think if we were to use, like, you know, let's just take Brexit for an example, just, you know, easy one. If you wanted to discuss that, I guess the way you would employ a longue durée history is to understand, well, different parts of Wales have different understandings of themselves because of their historical past. So, you know, you have the kind of north and western areas that were kind of more defended from Anglo-Saxon culture going back, you know, millennia, centuries, and that's also why they're more Welsh-speaking. You know, you have the fact that the south was lowland, had better agriculture, etc., is the reason why it was originally colonized, and then that also affects the specific sort of Welsh within British understandings. So although you might not need to kind of explain all that in detail, it's probably worthwhile to hold it in your head whilst you're discussing kind of events that are happening today.
I see. So in your work, as I understand it, you make an argument that to understand the nation's economy, it's necessary to see it as part of a wider world system. So I guess we'd need to explain to the listener what that world system is, and to myself, because I don't know what you're referring to, and why do we need to see it from this standpoint?
Of course. So a world system, so it's world-system, is a specific kind of, well, I define it as a sort of network of, and inside that network, there are political, social, economic relationships, and wealth and power, etc., are sort of contained within that. So to take it back a step, the way you'd originally look at, say you wanted to talk about the history of Wales, you're kind of a bit like a scientist in his lab. You're trying to observe Wales under a microscope, separate from what you might call the background noise, right? So it's as if Wales exists independently on its own as something you can observe. Now, what world systems analysis says is that, well, Wales or Britain or wherever doesn't exist as a place on its own to observe, because the economy of Wales, as we know, didn't just develop as it did because Welsh people chose it to develop like that. We understand that there's these other processes behind it. So if we look at coal, that coal wasn't being used because the Welsh needed it, right? It was used because the wider world system, mainly really at that time, it would have been things like the US Navy. Now, how do you understand why Wales transformed and developed without understanding what the US Navy was doing, how things like forest degradation in the UK led to the move towards coal, etc. So it's understanding that each place in this system has a job to do. And that job isn't always a positive job, and it's not always a job that the place gives to itself. So a poor country wouldn't choose to be poor. It wouldn't choose to be an exporter of raw materials. If you could choose, you would choose to be some sort of high-tech, high-value society, right? But what it's essentially doing is, it's control the system sort of reinforces itself. So there are power dynamics within it where the rich countries create a system that upholds it. So even if you look at something like trade with African countries, Germany, for example, makes more money from the coffee industry than every country in Africa put together. Now, Germany obviously doesn't make coffee. It can't grow coffee. What Germany does is that it roasts the coffee, grounds it, packages it, and we say that's what gives it value. Now, the reason that happens is because Germany, countries like it, have said, we will buy raw coffee beans from you, but we will not buy ground coffee from you. Now, that means that if countries in Africa that, like Kenya, wanted to develop a coffee making production, then they can't sell it, or makes it much more difficult to sell. So the system, the economy in which we live isn't value neutral. There are kind of powers and tendencies within it that structure your place. So if we want to understand Wales and why the economy of Wales works in the way it does, we need to understand the job it's been given in the system.
And how does the geography and the history of Wales interact with what you've just explained about the world system and interact with that long-term development of a nation? What aspects of Wales's geography and its past might still be influencing the way our economy works today then?
I think quite a lot, actually. So, I mean, if we take it again to just, language and culture, for example, if you want to look at the places that are more kind of have more Welsh language skills and abilities, that's mostly places to the west of Wales. Now, that's because there's a big mountain ridge in the middle, which makes it much more difficult for other cultures and ideas to kind of permeate through. If we want to think about agriculture and farming, now, even though much of Wales's economy is based around agriculture, it's not actually a particularly good country for agriculture. The land is actually quite bad for growing things, which is why we mostly have, it was originally cattle and now sheep. And because of the way this works, historically, kind of going back to the 15th century, what you saw in England was farms would become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, because what you'd have is that you'd have the productive farmers who knew how to farm it best would buy the plots from quote unquote worse farmers. And this is actually the idea, this is how capitalism developed as well. Now, because in Wales you couldn't grow things much above a subsistence level, farming and society stayed much more sort of communitarian, was much more around kind of production for use rather than exchange or to buy. It's kind of shaped how we had what we call a havod and a hendra, so a place that you go in the uplands in the summer and then the lowlands in the winter. If you look at Wales's farms today, they're about half the size of England's. And again, I think this comes from this very kind of long-term history of understanding our geography and the way that our kind of society kind of was built around that. If you look at the valleys communities, now most of these were literally created to extract something, in the sense that they didn't really exist as natural places before. So what's happened now is that, you know, the reason for their existence has gone, and yet of course the place you live is really important to people. So what do you do with places that once their reason for being is gone? You know, they are inherently difficult places to reach. They inherently make kind of communication or kind of clustering really difficult, because each valley's got a small community. So even the way that our towns and our cities are kind of built are kind of shaped by that long term, that kind of geography, etc. You know, why is Wales why is Cardiff the capital? We didn't have a capital until I think it was 1955. You know, and again, the fact we didn't have a capital, we didn't have a centre of power, was because our terrain makes it so difficult for kind of concentration to happen. But then there's, you know, if you look at Cardiff, it's by the sea, it's close to the valleys, it's close to Bristol, and that's probably the reason why it became a capital as well. Those are just a few examples, but I think that does kind of show why I think it's important to take this sort of long-term view of things.
Yeah, so one of your findings is some degree of economic independence can improve a stateless nation's development. I suppose we're starting to see that a bit with having Cardiff as a capital, and there being it becoming a bit more of an economic hub. But what could that look like for Wales? You know, not just constitutionally, but in terms of future development of industrial strategy or investment and taxation. Have you any views on that and how that relevant to your work?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously if we're looking at the world system, so being independent isn't sort of a silver bullet, in the sense that you're independent to make all decisions you want now, because you're still kind of confined by, you know, your role within it. So but understanding that role and understanding that position, I think, is the first stage in kind of overcoming it, if that makes sense. If we understand why we do the things we do, we can then try and kind of change those things. So I think for me, a really big thing would be, I do think that the state needs to be involved in some sort of development bank. I know that we have one, but being kind of very specific in the types of things that we want to do. So being quite strategic in the industries we choose, and ensuring that that sort of value spillover stays within Wales. So I think that's really a big one. So making sure that industries are kind of tied to the ecological advantage we have. We have a lot of ecological disadvantages, as we kind of discussed, but there's also, you know, some really good things. We do have lots of deep ports that really can be used. Port Talbot, Milford Haven is a really good one. Wind, tidal, these type of things. I would be looking at putting conditionality in a lot of these kind of concessionary loans and grants, etc. So ensuring that anything in the supply chain is used has to be from Wales or from the local community, because that's how you create those sort of spillovers. Understanding that most sort of bank loans do not really care or worry about the wider effects of the community, right? It's about that sort of short-term gains. So a sort of developmental bank would have to look at things differently. It's not about those short-term gains. It's how do we ensure that they develop over the long term a country that can kind of self-sustain itself. There are a few other things you could do. So one of the big problems Wales has is that it doesn't have a problem actually with starting businesses. Startups actually does okay. The issue is then when it gets to that stage where it wants to grow. So what tends to happen is if you're a Welsh company and you're doing quite well, you move to London, or a company from England buys you. Now, what I'd be doing is looking at sort of the Welsh Development Bank taking kind of minority stakes in these businesses when they need money. So even if they do decide then to leave, there's still a percentage of that capital being kept in Wales. Of course, you'd rather it all being kept in Wales, but that'd be one way of doing it. And I guess also anchoring these institutions within the wider community and being able to kind of build wealth and value in that way. So how you could have sort of anchors which are state-run, so NHS trusts, universities, councils, and they then become the anchor through which you try and build a sort of value chain around it. Now, none of this is, of course, easy to do. It is difficult, but we are not going to be a country, I don't think, that is able to, well, I'm not even sure I'd want to, but it's not about trying to attract Apple or these types of things. I don't think that's what we should try to go for. It's about making sure that value is embedded in the community. I think that is the really major thing, is that embeddedness, so it doesn't leave when it can.
But that's going to require a longue durée approach to policy and policymakers, and I guess I would argue that the institutional structures that have been given to Wales by Westminster don't suit that way of thinking. They aren't designed for that way of thinking. They're designed for the Senate to constantly have to go cap in hand back to Westminster. So have you any ideas on or thoughts on how we start that process of developing that economic independence within Wales so that we can put many of those ideas across?
So I think there are a few things you can do sort of straight away. Now, of course, I agree with you that you are hamstrung by the system in which you work. There are things you can do. So you can decrease tax specifically on local businesses, which is something you could do right now. There is nothing stopping a Wales Development Bank of becoming, in a way, self-sustaining. So we already have that bank. If you put in kind of capital seed money, the hope then would be that through good investment decisions, that you have a return on that investment, and then you reinvest that into other companies. So it wouldn't have to be some sort of black hole that you put money in and then keep on topping it up. The whole purpose of it should be that then it's self-funding, it's self-sustaining.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to clear something up that maybe you know better than myself. I understood that the Internal Markets Act, which I think Boris Johnson's government brought in 2020, would prohibit preferential treatment to one nation over another. So if you were favouring Welsh businesses and an English or a Scottish business doing the same thing came to Wales, you under that act, you weren't allowed to give them preferential treatment.
Well, so this is, I think, a way of that. I do think we have to be quite creative in the way that we do things. So, if you look at the Preston model, for example, which is a model that I very much like, and that in reality does give preferential treatment to places in the Preston area. So you might not be able to say Welsh businesses. You would say, local businesses, right? Or in the community, right? You can, the one I used to always really push for, one of the policies was that you could use police and crime commissioners to essentially decriminalize drug use. So you could make it as a way of, creating safe hubs for people to kind of consume drugs. So the way you do that is a police and crime commissioner has a list of priorities and how much money they're going to give to each priority. So you can essentially defund going after people smoking marijuana, for example, or defund the criminalization of heroin use and instead put that money into safe clean rooms for people to use. So now, of course, you are not technically decriminalizing drug use, right? Because you do not have the power to do that. But you do have effectively the power to change the way that you police these things. So within the system you have, I think there needs to be some sort of creativity in the way that we do things. There's also a reality here of, why do we give such credence to these things? We say that they're unfair and they're unjust, and yet we stick very, very sort of dearly to them. I think sometimes, you are given what you take, or, you are given what you ask for. I do think there's a sort of smallness of mind sometimes of thinking in the way that we kind of interact with these things. So you're certainly not wrong. But, a bit of creativity, I think, could really help with this.
So, yeah, with your studies and you looked at Catalunya and Mezzogiorno, and are they doing things that are particularly innovative in policies that we could use in Wales to inspire a more resilient or self-sustaining Welsh economy?
So, yeah, I guess with world systems analysis, I think what's different again is, as I said, with traditional ways of looking at it, you're in a lab and you're trying to sort of isolate things that you can compare between them. World systems analysis is a bit different in that you're trying to show what makes a place unique rather than what makes them similar. So it's not quite the same as being able to grab a policy from Catalunya and say, we want to do this, because of course the way Catalunya is developed is very, very different. The Mezzogiorno I use as an example, unfortunately, that's a place that's even in more dire straits than Wales. And the reason for that is that it's got sort of no economic or institutional capacity at all. Catalonia is very different in that regards, but it's also much richer as well than Wales. I think some of the places with the best examples, the Basque Country, I think specifically around the 70s and 80s and the transition. So there is a very strong argument that, mining in Wales was dying anyway. It had been kind of on decreasing since 1920s, really. Do we want people to go down and work in the pits? I don't think that is the issue. The issue really is what happened to those people afterwards. There was no transition at all. It was just, this is gone. It's the only kind of embedded sort of local place of work, which also funded all these other sort of spin-off institutions, high-skilled people, just kind of left to one side. So the Basque Country as well was a very, very kind of heavy industry-based place in up until the 70s and 80s, like Wales. Now, it had this sort of institutional and economic capacity where it did transition away from these things towards kind of high value added kind of goods, but retrained its people. So that kind of retraining aspect, which really it could only do because of its sort of quasi-independence. The Basque Country is essentially independent apart from foreign policy.
It also had ETA, so we're not suggesting that people of Wales start a paramilitary group.
Well, the Basque Country, I mean, not to go kind of too historical on it, but the Basque Country used to be called the Three Basque Provinces. It wasn't seen as a country until the 20th century, and it was actually kind of a very racist sort of understanding of nationhood. If you look at sort of Sabino Arana, who's one of the kind of founders of Basque nationalism, he argues that the rest of Spaniards are Arabs and Jews mostly, and that the Basque Country is different because it's kind of properly European. So, again, there's kind of really difficult, kind of uneasy answers in all of this. One of the interesting ones I thought was something I didn't discuss at all in the PhD, but the Faroe Islands, I think is a particularly interesting one because, places like the Basque Country, Catalunya, they are really quite powerful places that, Wales isn't in the same way. Scotland as well is in that same boat, I'd say. Whereas what the Faroe Islands did is very much this sort of niche specialization. So you do not need to be the best in the world at everything or even a lot of things, A place like Wales is never going to be that, and that's entirely fine, I think we do actually talk a lot with politicians as well, talk a lot about being the best place to grow up. Like, let's just be good at a lot of things. I think that's all we need to be at the moment. But like, what do the Faroe Islands do well? It's fishing, essentially, fisheries. So they've essentially created this network of institutional capacity, education, all around the fishing industry and fisheries. Now, that's really what Wales needs to do. It needs to find its niche. Now, I would say that niche, particularly if I was to choose one, would be wind power. That would be the one I'd go after. Again, the issue with comparing too much, I mean, people always say Quebec as well. I know that's somewhere that you might consider. But, the way Quebec and Canada kind of came into existence is so different to Wales. Apart from being, I don't know if you want to call Quebec a stateless nation, it's very difficult to kind of drag and drop certain policies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that I personally am very passionate about is Wales learning from places like Quebec, and particularly what Quebec did was it understood that it had resources, both in its people and the natural resources. And obviously back in the 1960s, when René Lévesque really brought these ideas to the fore, his argument, which I think has been proven out by time, was, well, we need to control something. We need to control our energy. So he went for hydroelectricity and hydro systems. So you've got Hydro-Quebec, which is an extremely successful company, which is set up with that ideal of giving a mandate to the people of Quebec to control their own economy. And Hydro-Quebec exports electricity all over Canada into the US. There's clearly a parallel there for what Wales could do with wind offshore and tidal. And yet there doesn't seem to be, from any of the political spectrums, that conversation and vision and that narrative presented to the people of Wales. This is what we could become. So that ties into what you're saying about specialization into wind. And you also drew on agriculture and it not being maybe perfect industry for Wales in its traditional sense. But then agriculture has evolved and is needing to evolve to meet climate challenges and so forth. And that's something, again, that Wales has a history of and could specialise in. So there's a few ideas there that I personally have. And I wonder why it's not being really pushed or discussed at a policy level within the Senate.
Well, you're absolutely spot on. So I guess, yeah, that was the point, was that, finding your niche. So I guess the point was that your niche will be different dependent on where you are. So the niche of Faroe Islands will be different to that of Quebec, which will be different to that of Wales. So what I meant was, you can't say Quebec's done hydroelectric, that works, so we should do hydroelectric. As in understanding that sort of, yeah, what can we do well within the confines and the capacity we have? I think you're absolutely spot on. And yes, I think agriculture is another one of those that we could do really well in if we kind of, as you say, change the frame of reference. So we could, it would be looking at what makes Welsh food unique in a way. How do we sort of maybe create a designation of origin sort of status? You got Halen Morn from Anglesey. What makes Welsh lamb special, unique, Caerphilly cheese, these sort of value-added conceptions. So how do we change, could we change some of our milk production towards more things like, drying milk, yogurt, cheeses, which doesn't seem like much, but there's actually a lot of value being added in doing those things. Now, because most of Wales's farms are still small-sized family farms, this isn't something that would be able to be done at an individual level. I don't think that's possible. So how do we then kind of create some sort of cooperative ways of, dealing with these as well? And that's something we could look at. Also, the role of food. I don't actually know how much Welsh farmers actually feed people in Wales, not because of any fault on their behalf. I mean, in the sense that food production is so globalized that, we do get something like 40% of our lamb from New Zealand, which is something that doesn't make sense, but that entails changing the way that we understand food, the way we understand the economy, the way that there are things that are perhaps more important than just cost. But yes, the things we do, the things we have is agriculture. How can we sort of create some high value production in that? Natural resources. I think those are the two big things I'll be going after. With regards to your question about why are we not seeing these things? So not to bring it back to the world system again, but if we're looking at, say, from a UK perspective, what does the UK government want us to do? Or, UK government is happy for Wales to be a place of low-cost labour, a place that you can put your call centres, the place that if you need... So, for example, if you think of the main industries that developed after coal in South Wales, it was mostly sort of low-value production lines, Hoover, etc. And what they tended to do was they used to hire women because they were cheaper than the men at the time, right? Because of the kind of patriarchal way that society worked at that time. So the reason they chose that was because, we know this place needs jobs, and we're going to feminize the labor force because we want to pay them less. Now, they are, I think, if you look at as well the things that the UK government gives us money for, it's places like defence. They want to use Wales as a place to develop its military, and that's our job. So in a way, they don't need our job to be a place that adds higher value through agriculture, through green energy, etc., because it's not what they think we should do. With regards to the Senedd, that's a bit more of a difficult one. I think Labour are in this really kind of strange position where they don't really understand what they're for. Is their purpose to represent the British state in Wales? Is their purpose to represent their specific conception of Wales and its job? And it's also kind of changed very much since the 90s. And I think the fact that knowing up until perhaps next year that you are always going to be the biggest party does in a way create this sort of feeling of, it doesn't matter, right? It's a mentality of we'll be okay. Plaid Cymru, an interesting one. Plaid Cymru's biggest problem is probably having very different coalition bases within its kind of membership. You see this quite a lot, that sometimes policies seem a bit contradictory. How do you get these new people involved and from the more kind of industrial south compared to its traditional kind of voting base in the west and north, which is something that it's grappling with, but I think certainly doing the job better than most. And then you have just the institution itself. So it's only until very recently really that we've had any real sort of lawmaking powers. It was a council essentially. And if you're working in a place where you don't feel that you've got real power and that you're not going to kind of push the margins, as I kind of suggested that maybe we should, what you're going to end up doing is things like banning meal deals, that type of thing, because that's where you think, you have to justify your existence in some way. So, yeah, I think we just need a bit more purpose of action, I think, in the way that we do things.
Yes, I would agree with you there. I'd like to look at some of your ideas on the nationalism side.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be, I think, right to suggest that we see nationalism becomes more politically potent when there's uneven economic development,
mm-hmm.
and that uneven economic development often usually develops at moments of crisis, and we can see that society has a feeling that it's going through multiple crises. We've got climate crisis, we've got economic stagnation, cost of living, constitutional uncertainty, perhaps. So how can we make sense of that? And particularly, I'm really interested to look at how we make sense of all of those issues, and that we've got many voters in Wales with the Senate elections in 2026 coming up who strongly identify as Welsh, but seem to be favouring Reform UK, which, when it comes down to it, is an extreme right-wing English nationalist party. Mm-hmm. And none of that seems to sort of dovetail in my head. So have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah. To turn the conversation in a very slightly Marxist direction for a moment, I think that these crises are sort of interlinked. So the way that I discuss capitalism is that it's a system that never pays its debts. So what tends to happen, if you look historically, what do we do? The Europeans discover America, take its resources, gold, silver, fisheries, wood, etc., timber, kind of degrade it and then move on. Then the next frontier would have been, coal. What does it do? It moves to places like Wales, Appalachia, etc., degrades it, moves on. Now, the way it pays its debt was usually it put things into the atmosphere, right? You'd put kind of CO2 into the atmosphere, or you'd put it underground. Now, we've got to a point now that we can sort of no longer do that. These things aren't cheap anymore, in the sense that they're not, cheap to produce. So all these crises now, it doesn't know how to reproduce itself. Does it move in a direction towards kind of, green transition? But the issue is that some capitalists are finding it difficult to see, how do we make money from this? So if we can't make money from it, it's not something that, we're kind of really looking for. We're going to kind of keep on pushing with what we have until we can't do it anymore.
So to push back a little bit on that, mm-hmm. Would the argument to the contrary be that in that process, whilst there might be some truisms in what you're saying, you're developing society, improving people's living standards, giving people a better, easier way of living and receiving the resources they need for day-to-day activities. And that's the purpose, as capitalism would see it, of doing those things. So how is it not that we just, perhaps us as consumers are constantly expecting more from the system that has reached perhaps its pinnacle, and we need to accept that we're not going to get more out of the system as it currently works?
Yeah, well, I mean, Karl Marx himself said that capitalism was the best system that's existed so far. I mean, if you look at the kind of technological developments that have happened into capitalism, they're brilliant. I'm not arguing that we should go back to a feudal system or something like that. So in that sense, certainly true. And I guess again, it depends on the lens and the frame of reference we're looking at. If we were to have a more just system, it would probably mean 700 million people in the world having a bit less, and about 7.4 billion people having a lot more. So, obviously,
what is that? What is just? Who makes that decision on what's just? How do you quantify that?
I'm getting very metaphysical. Yeah.
Perhaps it's a bit deeper than we got time for on the podcast, but it's just. I think you're right in many of your ideas that you're putting forward, but for me, as I see it, it's more to do with, there's a combination of people continually expecting more out of a system that has reached a point where it needs to change, and that includes the way we do politics and the way we do economics, and yet nobody accepting responsibility or that we have to do that.
Yes, I think the disagreement is that I might think it's an inherent condition of capitalism that it doesn't know how to do that, and that you might think that it's just that we can't get there yet. So I think, which I'm very fine to kind of leave that disagreement. It's not a particularly kind of major one, in a sense, if I'm wrong, that means climate catastrophe is kind of isn't here, then I'm fine with being wrong on that point, what was
I suppose where I'm trying to get to is there's clearly frustration in most of the populace of Wales. People clearly are not happy. Unfortunately, that seems to be pushing a lot of people either to completely disengage or to go to an extreme solution. Now, how does a responsible policymaker, politician, or advocate of business development engage with those people who might be thinking in either direction and say, no, there's another way? You don't have to smash up a playground, and equally, you do have to engage.
Yeah, well, I mean, so to kind of come to this idea of reform, there's the question of is it an English nationalist party? I mean, I can totally understand why, from a specific lens, we think about that. But if we kind of look at the politicization of Wales and Welshness, Welshness as an identity, I think, is very old, but kind of politically, it's always been Britain. Up until really, Thatcherism, I'd say, is that period that really changed. So most people don't see any contradiction between being very Welsh in a certain way and feeling politically British, which is not a feeling that I have at all, but it's a feeling that we have to understand, I think. So kind of just saying, you do realize that they're British nationalists, not Welsh nationalists or whatever, isn't actually something that might resonate with, those type of people that we're talking about. Also, unfortunately, the reality is that in Wales, we get our media through the lens of England and Britain, right? So who's shouting loudest, who's giving most oxygen in the media, etc. It certainly isn't Plaid Cymru or sort of a party of that kind of caliber. It's going to be this sort of Reform UK sort of framing. How do we kind of, I think there does have to be some blame put on the Labour Party here, certainly. I think people are entirely correct to kind of feel that they haven't been listened to, that they kind of, nothing has changed or improved. And you add that with crises, as you said, and then that creates this vacuum for this sort of politics to develop. Now, one thing I think we don't do is that we always tell people that they're wrong. I think that we see that a lot. I wrote something about Brexit in Wales not too long ago, and one of the comments was just that maybe we just have to understand that people are too stupid to understand what's going on. Now, that's not the way that we understand and discuss and improve these things. You know, we have to understand why these things happen, why people think that they do, and why we create scapegoats. Now, clearly, there hasn't been enough of a kind of unified vision that is different to this sort of right-wing reform vision that people can be able to kind of grasp. And I'm not someone who kind of discusses political visions and how we kind of show and dissect our political visions, but that's probably something that needs to be looked at. Does Welsh media matter? I think it certainly does. The way that we discuss these things, giving a space for these things to be discussed. How are we able to show people that they're correct to feel that the economy isn't getting better, and these are the things that I would do to improve them and make them better? Even if you look at, Labour at a UK level, they've been in power for about a year now. I don't think I can point to a single thing where I go, that's certainly made the lives of people better, So it really is a perfect storm at the moment, I would say.
But does that require a voter to look at the issues in that Longue Durée approach and understand that there aren't fixes, and maybe their lives won't be better, but perhaps by doing a certain thing, their children's and their grandchildren's lives could be?
Yeah, I think this is probably a question of what we mean by better, right? I don't think it necessarily means that you would have more money in your pocket necessarily, but the way in which society functions is something that certainly could be better, right? And I think this is something that people really, really care about. Is I think that society has become very, very individualized. I think things like, we see small things like fly tipping, rife in Cardiff. And I think that's because, we don't think about how the way that affects the wider community. So kind of creating that sort of communitarian sort of ideals that we did have in abundance, going back 40 years. And by embedding these sort of local economic things and understanding that the value being created stays in the community, I think that certainly then would give more pride and understanding to the way we live and where we live and how we live. And I think that's the things that we should be looking at, that's the things that we can really improve. And in a way, if your money in the pocket doesn't change as much, but you feel more secure in your rental tenancy, if you enjoy walking down the street where you live, if you know that you're going to see a GP if something goes wrong, if you know that when your mother gets older that she'll be cared for, those things I think in a way value and are worth a lot more. So I think we can definitely kind of create a better society in that sense. But no, I don't think we're ever going to be, have the money in your pocket that someone in London might do. But I personally don't think that should be the aim of what we're kind of striving for.
So just drawing the conversation towards a close, and on what you've written about and studied, have you any ideas or advice that a future Welsh government, say we task a future Welsh government with building that fairer society, and in whatever way we want to use the word, a more prosperous nation, over the next 25 years, And are there 3 values, say, that you would suggest should be at the centre of all the policies that come out of a new Welsh government?
3 values. Yes, I think the first one I would choose is self-reliance and community resilience. That would be a really big value for me. So trying to reduce where we can the sort of dependence on external capital and decision makers, making sure that communities can exist as much of that as possible in such a globalized world on itself, and that they are not perhaps dependent on one sort of one industry in the way that has happened in the past, where that goes, that everything else falls. The second one would be that innovation is very much grounded in place as in space, which is kind of what we discussed earlier, so that our sort of innovations, the way we spend our money kind of as a government or as a development bank or whatever, is sort of based on the actual ecological and social contexts of Wales. I think that would be my second one. And then third one would be kind of ecological justice, the way that we do these things in a way that doesn't kind of wreck the planet. Because I am still very much a believer that capitalism is a system that doesn't pay its debts. And then just to add a fourth one kind of quickly, I think the last one would be global solidarity. So within kind of looking again through that world systems lens, it is possible for countries to move up the ladder, to kind of improve its position. But it's very difficult to do that without actually adversely affecting other regions and making the lives of other people worse. It's kind of inherently sort of hierarchical in that sense. So how do we ensure that what we do doesn't sort of negatively affect other places? I think in kind of specifically that Wales does kind of, Welsh government does spend quite a lot of money on arms fairs and those types of things, and does kind of, look at its technology in those kind of areas. Now, of course, there's kind of news this week that perhaps some of these things developed in Wales are being used at the moment in Palestine. So are we ensuring that the development we have doesn't adversely affect other places? Those would be sort of my values that I would like to ground any kind of future policy in.
Thank you. I suppose my final question then is, where do you see Wales in the next 15 years from now? Whether you want to take that economically, politically, culturally, however you want to answer that.
I think Wales is in this actually quite interesting position in that I think it actually does have a very, very strong culture that makes it different. And that difference isn't something that's going away. I think there's a really strong identity from which to build some sort of movement from. And what's particularly sort of exciting from my point of view is that, if you look at sort of Scotland, for example, Scotland is still very much already sort of a state in its own right. It was never fully kind of subsumed into Great Britain or England. It's very kind of, middle class, bourgeois, etc. And in that way, it's not kind of interested in changing the system as much. It wants to just kind of join its place within the system. Whereas Wales, I think, has a much more sort of interesting possibility and opportunity of showing how can a country which is relatively peripheral within the system actually kind of change things for the better. So I try and be excited and optimistic more than sort of the sort of Gwynalf Williams idea of a people under an acid rain. I think Wales is something that we will into being, And if we can will hard enough, kind of a really truly independent in all meanings of the word, and a better Wales, I think we can will that into being.
Thank you very much. I want just a final thought then. Have you plans to write books or anything of that nature?
So I've just written one.
Right.
It's been the English is Welsh language and English language, based on the PhD generally. The English language version has passed peer review. The Welsh one's in peer review right now. Should be out in hopefully about a year's time, with University of Wales Press, give or take. So yeah, that's something I'm really excited about. So it's looking at the history of North and South Italy, Catalunya and Wales through the last sort of 1,000 years, but looking at how they kind of interact as stateless nations within the world system. I do kind of, it's supposed to be for a general audience. I've tried to not make it too academic. So I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, sorry.
So what's the title of the book? Sorry.
It's been changing quite a bit, but I think
Okay.
I've finally stuck with one. I think it's going to be Beyond the State, Nation, Class and Geography in the World System. And then my next sort of big task is, I don't know why, but I really want to write a complete history of Wales, kind of going back to the earliest times to today. So that might be 20 years in the making, who knows? But that is something that I really want to complete at some point.
That does sound like a long-term project.
It's very much a project in the Longue Durée, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Samuel Parry, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for being a guest. If you enjoyed this conversation, have comments on today's topic, or would like to be a guest in a future episode of Blueprint Cymru, head over to the New Wales website, which is new.wales.